Hello, denizens of the internet. Now that I've had time to digest the event that was WWDC 2020, I will relate to you my thoughts arrived through cogent analysis and my experience as a gearhead, Apple fan, Apple consultant, owner of many Macs, and as a business person. I am especially interested in how this all fits into Apple's business. Go watch those other silly software demos of what's new with macOS 11. My denizens come here for deep thought. Welcome back. I have to say that writing this was an interesting journey, as you will see. On the surface, we saw a new Mac of some kind running macOS 11, Big Sur, or Mac iOS for all intents and purposes, and my mind was reeling with questions. But let me start with some simple things and I will build to the meaty conclusion. I'm still pondering the nonsense of a pre-recorded WWDC presentation that was first broadcast like a primetime TV show and then made available to view anytime like a regular YouTube video. Why not just post the damn thing so we could watch it when we wanted to? I do get the feeling that this ploy probably worked exceedingly well. However, I felt like I had been had, and I'm not going to fall for this again next time. So if it's not live, I'll just wait for the posted video. It's sad to see macOS 10 go, but it was time. I was shocked that Apple picked such an identity-insensitive name as Big Sur for OS 11, but I'll let cancel culture deal with that. I remember the move from OS 9 to 10 was huge and fraught with potential failure. OS 9 was a horrible, buggy OS. Windows 3.1 had multitasking and was kicking business ass. Apple was surviving on the fumes of its goodwill. Steve Jobs had returned and just barely returned Apple to profitability by slashing products and introducing the hugely successful Candid iMac line. Apple was furiously trying to Macify next step into macOS 10. Version 1 wasn't even a desktop version. It was available only as a beta server product. Well, actually version 0 was Cheetah, and while it was stable, it was slow as balls. Puma was better, but not much software support. Many major software makers were staying away from OS 10 because they had no confidence in its future or Apple's future. OS 10.2 Jaguar was the first version that demonstrated the promise of OS 10. That's enough going down memory lane. Apple clearly remembered those early trials, but they are now flush with cash, resources, and have worked hard to make this platform change successful. When Apple was relying on Motorola and IBM to support PowerPC, Apple was really their only high-volume customer, but not high enough volume to invest in better processors and delivered more quickly. Now, Apple is making bags of chips to support their iOS devices. Apple don't need nobody, well, except for TSMC. Will Apple's ARM computers be cheaper? Well, that would be encouraging. Really, what Apple wants is better margins. Microsoft went down the ARM route with a version of Windows 8 on the Surface RT back in 2012, which was a total disaster. Now, there is a brand new ARM Surface X or 10 or whatever, which is far better but still gets its clock cleaned by the much faster iPad Pro. Still, Microsoft has no choice. The march to lower power, higher performance processors is relentless, and Intel so far is losing the game. The jostling to see whose OS philosophy will win out in the long run has been fascinating. Certainly the one ring to rule them all vision was Microsoft's approach when it developed the messy and reviled Windows 8. Apple's separation of a Mac OS that worked with mouse input and a portable OS that worked exclusively with touch seemed to be the right way to go, as Windows 8 didn't seem to be very good at either. But with Microsoft's persistence, Windows 10 seemed to have figured it out, and the experience between its Surface computers and Windows desktops was really good, and in many ways seemed to be a much more mature corporate option than Apple's Jekyll and Hyde approach. The introduction of the iPad Pro stunned the market, and suddenly it looked like an iPad could actually be used as a day-to-day computer. No one questions Apple's success with the iPhone, but the iPad owns the tablet market outright. Now we have Microsoft having to embrace ARM the only way they can, once again pushing Windows down into a platform with almost no native software support, whereas this time we have Apple pushing iOS up into an ARM-based Mac supported by a rich supply of mature iOS software, with the promise of Apple's own large software library are already ported, along with commitments from Microsoft and Adobe, with Rosetta 2's on-the-fly recompiler claiming to run Intel-based applications with little penalty. It makes Microsoft's Surface ARM efforts questionable. Add to this the fact that so far only Lenovo has jumped onto the Windows ARM bandwagon. I think there's only so much research I'm willing to do for my videos, okay? Apple suddenly looks very strong across all lines for the very first time. As for look and feel of Mac iOS, I'm not yet convinced. Mac OS for a time was heading towards a simpler, sophisticated interface, which they never really finished. This feels like a throwback. The OS 11 feels like a throwback to the very first version of OS 10. The interface Steve Jobs said looked so delicious you'd want to lick it. macOS design kind of stalled around High Sierra. Mojave didn't know whether it wanted to be Bauhaus or iOS House. While I have not experienced Mac iOS, at least it seems to be a completed vision, although its lack of contrast seems to be problematic. One thing I really hope they haven't copied from iOS is its software sandbox. Hopefully, Mac iOS retains the Mac software flexibility, whereby we can get applications directly from the software companies and not forced into an App Store software sandbox exclusivity. And of course, I would not want to lose connectivity options or Mac OS's file management. Please, Lord, do not bring iOS file management to Mac iOS. What is this GPU that Apple has developed that is so dang hot? Apple has used its own GPU design and stopped using Power VRs for the last 2 iterations of the Bionic chip, but they are iGPUs for all intents and purposes. They would naturally compete with or compare with Intel's Iris Plus offering. The general consensus, technical consensus, is that the Iris Plus wins on pure performance, but the A12Z GPU crushes it when it comes to performance per watt and performance per silicon area. While Craig happily showed off the Mac with its some unknown Apple ARM silicon, we also don't know what kind of GPU the computer was using either. A more robust iGPU, or maybe the Radeon cards Apple is now using in its Mac Pro that crush using Metal 2. Who knows what ARM chip will Apple actually put in their first Macs? Portables are an obvious choice. The desktop Macs will have better airflow and would allow for a more non-portable variant. Would Apple go so far as to create a unique chip for the Mac, something with many more cores? For all you ARM, not for Mac Pro doubters out there, look no further than the Fugaku, a Japanese supercomputer, brand new, that recently took top spot in the supercomputer rankings. It uses a Fujitsu 48-core ARM chip. It delivers 415.5 petaflops, which should be just enough to play Tomb Raider at 4K. ARM is not the pussy many are making it out to be. The last thing I'm curious about are the business goals. I get the hardware side. I'm sure the Apple chips will be cheaper than buying those stupid Xeons from Intel. But Apple is not doing this to maintain existing Mac sales levels. Will businesses buy more iOS Macs? Will this stop the education bleeding to Chromebooks? The iPad has proven to be an inadequate and expensive toy for schools. Will corporations shun non-Intel Macs? Yeah, this push only makes sense if Apple feels there's an upside in increased educational and corporate sales. No one's talking about that. Honestly, that's the plan I want to see. A Chromebook killer would be the first piece of Apple hardware on my list if I was Apple. For all intents and purposes, the Mac is dead. This is an iPad with an attached keyboard. Oh, and ports. And a better file system. But still, moving to ARM will let Apple fulfill its dream of being a completely vertically integrated company, beholden to no one. The only real downside to this is if you thought you were trapped in the Apple ecosystem before, you will now have your nuts in a vice also. I mean, for those members of society who have nuts, the alternatives I'm not allowed to talk about. Till next time, denizens. So, what is it, Wancho? Oh, is this the end of Hackintoshing? Ha! I doubt it. I'm looking forward to installing Big Sur on my Raspberry Pi. So long, denizens.